most critical dates in modern Zionist history falls, of course, this week, in 2 days' time, 29th of November 1947. 69 years ago, in Flushing Meadow in New York, the General Assembly of the relatively newly formed United Nations passed a resolution recommending the establishment of a Jewish state and an Arab state, of course, in Palestine. And this was 50 years after Theodor Herzl had practically prophesied the date when 50 years earlier he'd written in his diary that it would take 50 years from the first Zionist Congress for the Jewish state of Israel to emerge. So that's something which is coming up, of course, in a couple of days. And of course, 1947, 1948, the Jewish state came into being. Zionism had come home. So the idea of a Jewish return to the ancient homeland was a constant theme, especially in the 19th century. It had been building up during previous centuries, but in the 19th century it caught the imagination of a wide spectrum of writers and scientists and politicians and others. Walter Scott's 1820 novel Ivanhoe, the Jewess Rebecca, became the first 19th century literary figure to express this yearning of Jews to return home when she speaks of some second Gideon or a new Maccabeus who will arise to lead the people. 25 years after Ivanhoe, Catherine Elizabeth Tonner, one of the totally unknown novelists of the 19th century, whose novels included Judea Capta, a historical sketch of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, wrote the following. The sole of Israel's foot can know no rest till it be again planted on the mountains of Judea. Some place of refuge must be found for the hundreds of thousands of houseless Jews who will debark upon shores where those who love the Bible will not, cannot turn away from those who gave us the Bible. But the ultimate 19th century novel about the restoration of a political existence for the Jewish people appeared in 1876, more than 20 years before Herzl addressed the first Zionist Congress in Basel. How strange that the most widely read 19th century work calling for the Jews to re-establish their own Jewish state was not Herzl's Jewish state, not Leon Pinsker's Auto-Emanzipation, and not Moses Hess's Rome and Jerusalem. No, the most widely read, truly Zionist novel of the 19th century was written by the Gentile Victorian novelist Mary Ann Evans, known to us as George Eliot. Her novel Daniel Deronda was a dramatic and welcome departure from a long tradition in English literature of highly unflattering portrayals of Jews. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is steeped in ugly anti-Semitic blood libels. Shakespeare's Shylock makes The Merchant of Venice a profoundly anti-Semitic work, and Dickens' portrayal of Fagin in Oliver Twist feeds into age-old anti-Semitic stereotypes. Eliot's Daniel Deronda had both a Gentile plot and a Jewish plot. The Gentile plot is about the beautiful, stubborn and selfish Gwendolen Harleth, who learns the hard way that beauty and charm alone are not alone in life. Not enough in life. She marries the abusive Grandcourt, and their unhappy marriage only ends when he drowns. Throughout Gwendolen's ordeals, Daniel Deronda acts as her moral guide. He buys back jewelry that she pawned when she became impoverished, and he counsels her when she is distressed about the state of her marriage. The parallel Jewish plot of the novel starts when the Gentile Deronda saves Mira Lapidoth, an 18-year-old Jewess who is about to drown herself in the River Thames. Weak and famished after returning to London to search in vain for her mother and brother, Mira decides to take her own life. After saving Mira, Deronda finds himself drawn to Judaism. He visits synagogues. He is strangely moved by the Hebrew service, though he doesn't understand a word. And despite his feelings for Mira, Deronda knows that any serious relationship is doomed because of her attachment to her Jewishness. While searching in London's East End for Mira's lost family, he meets a consumptive Jewish visionary named Mordecai, who insists that Deronda must become his intellectual heir and advocate for the Jewish people. Not being a Jew, Deronda is understandably reluctant to accept the mantle of responsibility that Mordecai tries to place on him. However, Deronda does discover that Mordecai is in fact Mira's missing brother, and he effects a happy reconciliation between the siblings. Since he was a child, Deronda has suspected that he is the illegitimate son of his guardian, Sir Hugo Mallinger. The biggest surprise in the novel is when Deronda discovers that he was actually born to Jewish parents. His widowed dancer mother had begged her friend and suitor, Sir Hugo, to raise Deronda as an English gentleman and to hide his true identity from him. Now that Deronda knows that he is Jewish, he tells Mordecai that he now wishes to fulfill the role of advocate for the Jewish people that Mordecai had earmarked for him. And I quote, "It is through your inspiration that I have discerned what may be my life's task. It is you who have given shape to what I believe was an inherited yearning. Since I began to read and know, I've always longed for some ideal task in which I might feel myself the heart and brain of a multitude, some social captainship which would come to me as a duty and not be striven for as a personal prize. You have raised the image of such a task for me, to bind our race together in spite of heresy. You have said to me, our religion united us before it divided us. It made us a people before it made Rabbinites and Karaites. I mean to try what can be done with that notion. I mean to work in your spirit. Failure will not be ignoble, but it would be ignoble for me not to try. I am going to the East to become better acquainted with the condition of my race in various countries there." And now comes the Zionist nub of the novel. "The idea that I am possessed with is that of restoring a political existence to my people, making them a nation again, giving them a national center such as the English have. I am resolved to devote my life to it, at the least to waken a movement in other minds such as has been awakened in my own." And with such sentiments, it is clear why Daniel Deronda is called a Zionist novel. Now free to express his feelings to Mira, Deronda proposes. They get married in a synagogue and prepare to set off for the Holy Land. Mordecai intends to accompany them, but dies in the arms of his sister and his protege before they start their journey. The Jewish Chronicle published a predictably enthusiastic review of Daniel Deronda, saying of Eliot, "It was a great and noble task she undertook and succeeded." Now, if in today's talk I focus on Daniel Deronda as a Zionist novel at the expense of the Gentile Gwendolen plot, I am in very good company. In the words of critic Shmuel Verses, if someone were to excise from this story all the chapters which tell of these Gentiles who have almost nothing to do with the main theme and basic idea, and to leave only those chapters concerning the life of the Jews, the story would lack almost nothing. When David Frischmann produced the first Hebrew translation of Daniel Deronda in 1893, he removed all traces of the non-Jewish plot. Mind you, as Gertrude Himmelfarb writes in The Jewish Odyssey of George Eliot, Gentile critics had similar misgivings, only the opposite. Says Himmelfarb, there was an almost schizophrenic tone in many of the reviews. The believable characters, the English, versus the unbelievable characters, the Jewish ones. For example, 1877 review in the Academy. The question here is whether the phase of Judaism now exhibited, the mystical enthusiasm for race and nation, has sufficient connection with a broad human feeling to be stuff for prose fiction to handle. We think that it has not. Here is what the Saturday Review wrote. When a young man of English training and Eton and university education, and up to manhood of assumed English birth, so obliging also as to entertain Christian sympathies, finishes off with his wedding in a Jewish synagogue on the discovery that his father was a Jew, the most confiding reader leaves off with a sense of bewilderment and affront. The Saturday Review article prompted a sharp response from the contemporary American musician, poet, novelist, and critic Sidney Lanier. When I find this tone prevailing not only with the Philistines, but among a great part of George Eliot's otherwise friends and lovers, then I am in a state of amazement which precludes anything like critical judgment on my part. Gentile criticism of the Jewish theme of Daniel Deronda continued into the 20th century. Edward Said, the Palestinian professor of literature at Columbia University, predictably attacked Daniel Deronda's interest in Jewish settlement in Palestine. Literary critic FR Leavis wanted to reclaim Gwendolen for English literature by editing the novel's bad half and airbrushing Daniel Deronda out of the novel. And he proposed to write a novel with the following title: Gwendolen Harleth, George Eliot's superb last novel, liberated from Daniel Deronda. It never saw the light of day. And for someone whose wife came from a strictly Orthodox Jewish home, Leavis's motivation sounds suspiciously anti-Semitic to me. Leavis even has supporters in the 21st century, including the Jewish aspiring novelist Batya Ungar-Sargon, who recently asked how the great George Eliot could have mistaken as literature the story of a young man becoming Jewish so that he can marry a suicidal Jewess. Ungar-Sargon approvingly quotes Leavis: the less we are reminded of the Hebraizing background, the better. Yet, despite Ungar-Sargon's obvious distaste for the Zionist theme in Daniel Deronda, and leaving aside the argument between those who would ditch the Jewish plot and those who would ditch the Gentile plot, there is a legitimate question that we need to ask. In Hebrew, one would say, Ma pitom. What possessed the best-selling author of Adam Bede in 1859, The Mill on the Floss in 1860, Silas Marner in 1861, and Middlemarch in 1871 to write a novel with such a Jewish and Zionist theme? Well, one influence was Charles Christian Hennell, who wrote in his Inquiry Concerning the Origin of Christianity, Jacob shall be restored as a nation, a fresh race of Jews shall spring up and become a firm and flourishing people. We know that from 1855, Eliot's journeys abroad included visits to synagogues in Prague, Amsterdam, and elsewhere, and she also used to go to synagogue in London. She studied ancient, medieval, and modern sources of Jewish history, the Bible, the Talmud, Kabbalah, and the works of Maimonides and medieval rabbis. She read contemporary German, French, and English scholars, and she consulted with Jewish historian Heinrich Gretz, who predicted that the Jews would bring about their own rejuvenation and redemption. But the biggest single influence on Eliot was a brilliant young German Jewish scholar, mystic, lecturer, Hebraist, and librarian in the British Museum, Emanuel Oskar Menachem Deutsch. Deutsch met George Eliot and her common-law husband George Henry Lewes in 1866 at the home of Jewish-born German businessman Friedrich Lehmann. Deutsch became Eliot's devoted friend, and he tutored Eliot and Lewes in Hebrew. He actually taught them Hebrew. And they used to speak Hebrew when they went abroad, so nobody would understand them. Deutsch's passionate proto-Zionism taught Eliot much about the Jewish people's perpetual yearning for a return to Zion. Deutsch was born in 1829 to a strictly Orthodox family. I quote, "Before I knew how to read and write the language of the land wherein I was born, my lips were taught to stammer the Aleph-Bet and to recite my prayers in the tongue of," in the tongue of David. "It was deemed well to steep my soul for a time absolutely in the ocean called the Talmud." And it was Deutsch's seminal 1867 article on the Talmud, which demystified and de-demonized a work that church authorities had for centuries used to attack Judaism, propelled Deutsch to international fame. Deutsch fulfilled his lifelong dream by visiting the Holy Land in 1869. He wrote of the East, all my wild yearnings fulfilled at last. And in the autumn of 1872, longing to return to the sunshine and the sounds and the smells of Palestine, a severely ill Deutsch announced, "I would die happy if I could once more hear the hum of the East." Granted 6 months leave from the museum, Deutsch only got as far as Alexandria. He died there in May 1873 and was buried in the Jewish cemetery there. Deutsch's early death robbed Eliot of a good friend, and her Deronda and Mordecai characters were clearly a homage to Deutsch. Remarking that the novel made him think of our dear Deutsch, Sir George Grove said that, like Deutsch, Mordecai was a great scholar, a man weakened by disease, consciously within the shadow of advancing death, but living an intense life in an invisible past and future. But there was a wider perspective to Eliot's motivation to write Daniel Deronda, as is evident in a letter to her friend Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. "Towards the Hebrews, we Western people who have been reared in Christianity have a peculiar debt, and whether we acknowledge it or not, a peculiar thoroughness of fellowship in religious and moral sentiment." And she continues, "Can anything be more disgusting than to hear people called educated making small jokes about eating ham and showing themselves empty of any real knowledge as to the relation of their social and religious life to the history of the people they think themselves witty in insulting? They hardly know that Christ was a Jew, and I find men educated supposing that Christ spoke Greek."
Were these Jews?
This is George Eliot writing to her friend, discussing why Christianity owes a debt to the Jews. "I could not help noticing the similarity between these words written 140 years ago and something written recently by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby." And he writes, The habits of anti-Semitism have been burrowing into European and British culture for as long as we can remember. It is a shameful truth that through its theological teachings, the Church, which should have offered an antidote, compounded the spread of this virus. The fact that anti-Semitism has infected the body of the Church is something of which we, as Christians, must be deeply repentant. We live with the consequences of our history of denial and complicity." End quote. 2 years after the publication of Daniel Deronda, and just 2 years before she died, Eliot was still concerned with explaining why the Jews needed their own homeland. The last chapter of her 1878 Impressions of Theophrastus Such, capital S is someone's name, is entitled The Modern Hep, Hep, Hep. Hep is the derogatory acronym for the Latin Hieroslima est perdita, Jerusalem is lost, that was emblazoned on the banners of medieval crusaders as they set out to capture Jerusalem, murdering up to a quarter of Europe's Jews along the way. In 1819, the Hep, Hep cry reappeared in Bavaria, with riots sweeping throughout German cities and with the authorities as usual standing by and not doing anything to stop them. Eliot's words in the modern Hep, Hep, Hep would not be out of place in this morning's newspaper. I quote, "It would be difficult to find a form of bad reasoning about the Jews which has not been heard in conversation or been admitted to the dignity of print. But the neglect of resemblances is a common property of dullness which unites all the various points of view, the prejudiced, the puerile, the spiteful, and the abysmally ignorant. Men who consider themselves in the very van of modern advancement, knowing history and the latest philosophies of history, indicate their contemptuous surprise that anyone should entertain the destiny of the Jews as a worthy subject." End quote. 20 years before the birth of political Zionism, Eliot understood that the yearning for Zion lies deep in the Jewish psyche and that Judaism rests upon the three pillars of the people, the faith, and the land. We must not underestimate Daniel Deronda's influence on generations of Jews and non-Jews who would later play a major role in Zionist history. A.D. Gordon and Peretz Smolenskin, assimilated Jews who became Zionists after the brutal pogroms of the 1880s, quoted Daniel Deronda in their own polemics. Eliezer Yitzchak Perlman, better known to us as Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, the lexicographer, newspaper editor, and the man who did more than anyone else to create modern spoken Hebrew, loved the idea that the language of the Bible and the Talmud could be used to convey secular content. He said, "The fire of love for the Hebrew language burned within me. And after reading in the Russian journal Vestnik about Deronda's advocacy for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, Ben-Yehuda bought the novel." I quote, "After I read the story a few times, I made up my mind and I acted. I went to Paris in order to equip myself there with the information needed for my work in the land of Israel." Two highly influential American Jewish women publicly attributed the evolution of their Zionist thinking to George Eliot. Emma Lazarus, the poet who penned the famous words on the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free," started out as a secular poet writing for a general American audience. However, she felt excluded from the American canon. And just as Deronda chose to throw in his lot with his disenfranchised and oppressed people, rather than to climb to the lofty heights of English Protestant society, so Lazarus gave up being accepted by the American literary mainstream, and became the liberator of her humiliated people. She taught English to immigrant girls and worked as a celebrity volunteer in the Hebrew Emigrant Aid Society. In November 1882, in her first epistle to the Hebrews, Lazarus pleaded for an independent Jewish nationality and the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And I quote, "I am fully persuaded that all suggested solutions other than this are but temporary palliatives. The idea formulated by George Eliot has already sunk into the minds of many Jewish enthusiasts, and it germinates with miraculous rapidity." She continues, "If Eliot had lived but till today to see the ever-increasing necessity of adopting her inspired counsel, she would have been herself astonished at the flame enkindled by her seed of fire and the practical shape which the movement projected by her in poetic vision is beginning to assume." Lazarus dedicated her play, Dance of Death, which depicts the 13th century burning of the Jews of Nordhausen, I quote, "in profound veneration and respect to the memory of George Eliot, the illustrious writer who did most among the artists of our day towards elevating and ennobling the spirit of Jewish nationality." Henrietta Szold worked for the Jewish Publication Society as a translator and editor, and she translated into French works by Eliot's Jewish mentor, Immanuel Deutsch, who we mentioned earlier. Commenting on Eliot's impressions of Theophrastus such, Szold wrote, "The Jew has a historic claim on Palestine as Eretz Israel, and he has validated the claim by the volume and solidity of its achievement." Szold's Zionism was reinforced by her 1909 trip to Palestine, and she wrote, "The Jew and his Judaism can be perpetuated only by their repatriation in the land of the fathers." Inspired by both Eliot and Lazarus, Szold founded the Hadassah Zionist Women's Organization in 1912, which went on to establish hospitals, clinics, a visiting nurse system, and milk stations. Szold emigrated to Palestine, and in 1933 she became director of Youth Aliyah, the international rescue operation that helped my own father escape Nazi Germany in 1939. We opened this afternoon with Herzl's 1896 pamphlet, The Jewish State, Proposal of a Modern Solution for the Jewish Question. And the question that has intrigued many scholars is, was Herzl influenced by Daniel Deronda? A perfectly good question, since there was 20 years between the two publications. After all, Deronda's "I am resolved to devote my life to it" speech bears a remarkable resemblance to Herzl's diary entry after the First Zionist Congress in 1897. "At Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, you would be greeted with laughter. In 5 years perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it." And the surprising answer is that when Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat, he had not read Daniel Deronda. And how do we know this? From his diary entry in June 1895. "I must read Daniel Deronda. Perhaps it contains ideas similar to mine." Herzl learnt just how similar 5 months later, while on a visit to London, when he presented his Zionist project to the British chief rabbi. Dr. Hermann Adler sniffed dismissively. "This was the idea of Daniel Deronda," he says to Herzl. 19 years earlier, Adler had given public lectures on the novel, as reported by Eliot herself. "At the beginning of this week, I had deep satisfaction from reading in the Times the report of a lecture on Daniel Deronda delivered by Dr. Hermann Adler to the Jewish working men." Daniel Deronda continued to pursue Herzl a couple of days after his meeting with Adler. When Herzl met Colonel Albert Edward Williamson Goldschmidt, who converted back to Judaism when he discovered that his parents had converted to Christianity. A visit to the Holy Land in 1883 so stirred Goldschmidt that he was determined to persuade British Jews to help the Jews reclaim their heritage and returned to the land. Whatever Herzl expected when he travelled to Cardiff to meet the highest ranking Jew in the British Army, he probably did not expect Goldschmidt's dramatic declaration, "I am Daniel Deronda." And Goldschmidt's self-definition was not far-fetched. Like Deronda, Goldschmidt was a Jew who only discovered his Jewish identity in adulthood, and like Deronda, Goldschmidt committed fully to the cause of restoring the Jews to their ancient land. I have to say, I feel sorry for poor Herzl. In the space of a week, both Goldschmidt and Adler had invoked a fictional character in a novel that Herzl had never read. Of course, once Herzl established the Zionist movement, Daniel Deronda's proto-Zionism was rapidly adopted into the mainstream Zionist cause, and by 1899, just 2 years after the first Zionist Congress, the American Federation of Zionists published a pamphlet, George Eliot as a Zionist. So, to conclude, in his disingenuous speech in Cairo to the Muslim world, President Obama declared in the first year of his presidency that the state of Israel was born out of the ashes of the Holocaust and that, I quote, "the aspiration for a Jewish homeland is rooted in a tragic history that cannot be denied." Really smart thing to say to a Muslim audience. Several years prior to the first Zionist settlements in Palestine, and 2 decades before Theodor Herzl launched political Zionism, George Eliot and Daniel Deronda offered a far more persuasive justification for the state of Israel, that Judaism can reach its full potential only in a sovereign Jewish state. Eliot and Herzl proved far more knowledgeable than Obama about 4,000 years of Zionist history. In the view of the historian of Zionism, Nachum Sokolov, Daniel Deronda was the literary preface to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, whose 100th anniversary falls exactly in a year's time. Someone who knew a thing or two about the mind said about Daniel Deronda, "This novel did a better job of capturing the Jewish mind than anyone else." Any guesses for who might have said that? Freud. Absolutely, Sigmund Freud. In 1877, a year after Daniel Deronda was published, Joseph Jacobs, editor of the Jewish Encyclopedia, claimed that the novel had sparked a renewed interest in his Jewish roots. I quote, "Eliot is entitled to the heart-deep gratitude of all Jews. Mordecai's views on the resumption of the soil of the Holy Land by the holy people are the only logical position of a Jew who desires that the long travail of the ages shall not end in the total disappearance of the race." It didn't persuade Jacobs to make Aliyah, but it was a nice thing to say. David Kaufman was a lecturer in Jewish history and religious philosophy at the Rabbinical Seminary in Budapest. And in a pamphlet called George Eliot and Judaism, an attempt to appreciate Daniel Deronda, written in 1879, that's just 2 years after the novel came out, 3 years after the novel came out, Kaufman asks, "Who will dare to insist that the imponderable mass of indefinite feelings and vague impulses, which in the march of centuries has rather increased than decreased in the soul of the Jewish people, will pass off without leaving any trace?" Ladies and gentlemen, in light of the durable Zionist project, I think we are entitled to echo Kaufman when he asks, "Who will dare to say what may not result from this rising flood of feelings in the heart of the Jews?" Who, indeed? Thank you very much.